what's going on today.
What?
What's going on today?
Okay. So, you can readily understand English. Am I correct in this? You spoke English your whole life, right?
In Spanish, right? Yes, sir.
Okay.
Both languages.
Do you understand the rights I read to you earlier?
Yes,
Not that you understand the situation, because I haven't explained most of that.
Funny, because I didn't do anything. I'm really confused.
Right.
I work at the mall. Go ahead.
Let me explain it to you, but I need that clear to you before I explain it to you, because you're going to ask questions, and I'm going to ask questions, and we're going to go back and forth, and
yes, sir.
I need everything to be clear. So,
on April 26th, 2024, law enforcement officers were dispatched to a shopping mall following reports of a couple allegedly threatening individuals inside the premises. The call originated from mall personnel who described escalating behavior involving verbal intimidation, repeated confrontations with staff, and actions perceived as potentially dangerous to public safety. Given the setting, a crowded commercial space, the situation was immediately treated as a high-priority disturbance requiring swift intervention. Upon arrival, officers observed two individuals actively moving through the mall and refusing to comply with verbal requests to stop. Their continued movement away from officers complicated initial attempts to establish control and assess the situation. From a procedural standpoint, refusal to comply with lawful commands during an active investigation significantly heightens officer concern, particularly in environments where bystanders may be at risk. Mall security personnel provided officers with background information, suggesting this was not an isolated incident. According to their account, the same individuals had previously been involved in confrontations on mall property, including aggressive behavior toward staff and actions that had led to temporary lockdowns of administrative areas. This prior history contributed to the perception that the couple posed an ongoing disruption rather than a one-time disturbance. As officers attempted to detain one of the individuals for investigative purposes, resistance occurred. The subject did not comply with repeated instructions to stop, and later to position their body in a manner consistent with safe detention procedures. This resistance extended the encounter and increased the physical intensity of the arrest. From a law enforcement perspective, such resistance, whether active or passive, necessitates escalation to physical control methods to ensure safety and prevent flight. During the detention, the subject repeatedly questioned the legality of the stop and asserted constitutional violations, particularly citing First and Fifth Amendment rights. These claims are common in confrontational police encounters and often reflect a heightened emotional state rather than a clear understanding of detention law. In U.S. policing standards, officers are legally permitted to detain individuals temporarily when they have reasonable suspicion that the individual is connected to an ongoing investigation, regardless of the subject's belief in their own innocence. While the arrest was ongoing, officers worked to separate involved parties and secure the immediate area. Bystanders were instructed to remain back, and security staff assisted in maintaining crowd control. The environment remained tense, but no weapons were recovered during the physical detention phase. Following the detention, officers shifted from physical control to investigative clarification. Statements from mall employees revealed that earlier in the incident, one of the detained individuals had allegedly made threatening remarks suggesting potential violence. Additionally, gestures interpreted as reaching toward a waistband or bag had been observed by security personnel, contributing to fears that a weapon might be involved. Although no firearm was ultimately found, the report of such gestures played a critical role in establishing probable cause for detention. The investigation also revealed confusion and conflicting narratives. The detained individuals claimed to be mall employees or frequent visitors and denied making threats. They described the encounter as a misunderstanding escalated by mall staff. However, security personnel maintained that the behavior was aggressive, repeated, and disruptive enough to warrant police involvement and a formal trespass order. From a psychological standpoint, the detained subject exhibited signs of emotional dysregulation, including rapid speech, repeated assertions of victimization, and difficulty complying with structured commands. Such behaviors often complicate police encounters, as officers must balance constitutional protections with immediate safety concerns. While emotional distress does not negate lawful detention, it does influence how officers assess risk and control measures. After reviewing witness statements, officer observations, and prior incident history, law enforcement determined that sufficient grounds existed for formal charges. The refusal to comply with lawful commands, combined with alleged threats and physical resistance, met statutory definitions for multiple offenses under local law. Ultimately, both individuals involved were charged with disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and aggravated assault. The decision reflected not only the events of that day, but also the broader context of repeated disturbances at the same location. The case underscores the complex intersection of public safety, individual rights, emotional behavior, and law enforcement discretion within crowded public spaces. Following the initial detention, officers transitioned the situation from immediate control to a structured investigation. This phase focused on determining whether the behavior observed met the legal threshold for arrest, identifying credible threats, and assessing the reliability of competing accounts from the involved parties and witnesses. In incidents occurring within public commercial spaces, investigative clarity is essential due to the presence of civilians and the potential for rapid escalation. Law enforcement relied heavily on witness testimony provided by mall security personnel. These individuals reported a pattern of confrontational behavior extending beyond the incident in question. According to their statements, the same pair had previously caused disturbances, including verbal aggression toward staff and actions that prompted administrative lockdowns. Such historical context, while not determinative on its own, significantly influences probable cause assessments when evaluating intent and risk. A key investigative factor was the allegation that one of the individuals made threatening remarks implying potential violence. While no weapon was displayed or recovered, security personnel described repeated gestures toward the waistband and personal bag. In law enforcement training, such movements are treated as high-risk indicators, particularly in environments where concealed carry is legally permitted or common. Even in the absence of a weapon, perceived access to one can justify heightened officer response. The legal foundation for the detention rested on the principle of reasonable suspicion. Officers are authorized to detain individuals temporarily when specific and articulable facts suggest involvement in criminal activity. In this case, refusal to comply with lawful commands to stop, combined with reports of threats and aggressive conduct, satisfied that standard. When the detained individual continued to move away from officers, the situation escalated from a voluntary encounter to a custodial detention. Resistance during detention played a critical role in shaping the outcome of the case. Resistance does not require striking an officer. Under many state statutes, pulling away, refusing to comply with physical positioning, or obstructing handcuffing procedures may constitute resisting arrest. Investigators noted that the subject's non-compliance prolonged the encounter and necessitated physical force to gain control, increasing both legal exposure and perceived threat. From a psychological perspective, the subject displayed behaviors commonly associated with heightened emotional arousal. These included persistent verbal challenges to authority, fixation on perceived injustice, and difficulty regulating responses under stress. Such reactions can stem from fear, anger, or prior negative experiences with authority figures. However, emotional distress alone does not exempt an individual from compliance with lawful orders during an active investigation. Officers also documented repeated references by the subject to constitutional rights violations. While the First and Fifth Amendments provide essential protections, they do not negate an officer's authority to detain individuals temporarily during an investigation, or require officers to explain all details of an ongoing case in real time. Misunderstandings of these legal boundaries often contribute to escalation, as individuals interpret detention as punishment rather than a procedural necessity. The investigation further examined claims made by the detained individuals regarding their employment or affiliation with the mall. While they asserted familiarity with the location and staff, security management clarified that any such association did not grant immunity from trespass enforcement. Mall management formally requested a trespass order, citing repeated disruptions and concerns for staff safety. Under property law, private commercial entities retain the right to exclude individuals who interfere with business operations or pose safety risks. Another significant element was the report of a firearm threat allegedly made earlier in the incident. Although no gun was recovered, the allegation influenced officer decision-making. Law enforcement protocol prioritizes prevention over confirmation in potential weapon-related scenarios. The absence of a weapon at the time of arrest does not invalidate the seriousness of the reported threat, particularly when corroborated by multiple witnesses. As the investigation concluded, officers weighed the totality of circumstances: prior incidents, current behavior, witness statements, resistance during detention, and perceived threats. This holistic approach aligns with standard policing practices and legal precedent, which emphasize context over isolated actions. The decision to file multiple charges reflected not a single moment, but an accumulation of behaviors deemed disruptive and dangerous. The charges ultimately filed, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and aggravated assault, were grounded in statutory definitions that encompass threatening behavior, obstruction of law enforcement duties, and actions that place others at risk. While the defendants contested the narrative, the investigative record prioritized corroborated accounts and observable conduct. This phase of the case illustrates the complexity inherent in public order policing. Investigators must navigate competing narratives, emotional volatility, and legal constraints while ensuring public safety. The outcome underscores how quickly encounters can escalate when compliance breaks down and how behavioral responses, rather than initial intent alone, often determine legal consequences. By the conclusion of the on-scene investigation and arrest process, the incident had fully transitioned from a localized disturbance into a formal criminal case. What initially appeared as a confrontation inside a shopping mall evolved into a multi-charge prosecution involving public order offenses, resistance to law enforcement, and allegations of aggravated assault. At this stage, the focus shifted away from immediate control and toward long-term legal accountability. The filing of charges marked the point at which the justice system assumed responsibility for determining outcomes. Prosecutors now relied on documented evidence rather than real-time judgment. Body-worn camera footage, witness statements, security reports, and arrest documentation collectively formed the evidentiary foundation. These materials would later be reviewed to assess credibility, intent, and proportionality of both civilian behavior and law enforcement response. From a legal standpoint, the case illustrates how cumulative behavior influences charging decisions. No single action, taken in isolation, fully explains the severity of the outcome. Instead, the system evaluated the sequence as a whole. Repeated confrontations, refusal to comply with lawful commands, perceived threats, physical resistance, and prior incidents at the same location. Courts routinely assess such patterns when determining whether actions rise above minor misconduct into criminal liability. One of the most consequential charges, aggravated assault, deserves particular attention. In many jurisdictions, aggravated assault does not require actual injury or a displayed weapon. The charge may be supported by conduct that places others in reasonable fear of imminent harm, especially when directed at security personnel or officers performing official duties. Alleged gestures toward the waistband and bag, combined with verbal threats reported by witnesses, contributed to this classification even in the absence of a recovered firearm. The resisting arrest charge further solidified the legal framework of the case. Resistance, as defined by statute, encompasses more than overt violence. Failure to follow physical commands, pulling away, or prolonging restraint procedures can meet the threshold. Importantly, resistance charges often hinge on officer testimony and video evidence, making compliance during detention a critical factor in determining legal exposure. Beyond individual accountability, the case highlights systemic realities in modern policing. Officers are trained to prioritize risk mitigation in public spaces, particularly shopping centers where large numbers of civilians are present. Even ambiguous threats are treated with seriousness due to the catastrophic potential of weapon-related incidents in crowded environments. This risk-averse posture shapes decision-making long before definitive evidence is established. The role of private property rights also emerged as a decisive element. Shopping malls, while publicly accessible, remain privately owned spaces. Management retains the authority to request trespass enforcement when individuals disrupt operations or create safety concerns. The issuance of a multi-year trespass order reflects a preventative approach, aimed at reducing future incidents rather than punishing past behavior alone. Psychologically, the case underscores the impact of emotional escalation on legal outcomes. The individuals involved consistently framed their actions through a lens of perceived injustice and misunderstanding. While such perceptions may feel genuine to those experiencing them, the legal system evaluates conduct based on external behavior rather than internal intent. Emotional dysregulation, particularly when expressed through defiance or aggression, often intensifies rather than mitigates consequences. A recurring theme throughout the incident was the invocation of constitutional rights. This reflects a broader societal challenge: widespread misunderstanding of when and how rights apply during police encounters. Constitutional protections exist alongside, not in opposition to, lawful investigative authority. Temporary detention, identification requests, and use of force during resistance are legally distinct from punishment and do not inherently constitute rights violations. The case also reveals the limits of on-scene explanation. Officers are not required to fully articulate investigative details during an active detention, especially when safety concerns are present. Courts consistently uphold that explanations may be delayed until compliance is achieved and the environment is secure. Failure to recognize this distinction often fuels confrontation and escalates encounters unnecessarily. From a public safety perspective, the incident reinforces why compliance during investigative detention is critical, regardless of perceived innocence. Legal remedies for misconduct or error exist after the fact through courts and oversight mechanisms. Attempting to assert innocence through resistance or defiance during an active investigation typically worsens outcomes and narrows future options for defense. Ultimately, this case serves as a cautionary example of how rapidly situations can escalate when authority, emotion, and misunderstanding collide in public spaces. What began as a mall disturbance concluded with multiple criminal charges, long-term exclusion from the property, and lasting legal consequences for those involved. The broader lesson extends beyond this specific incident. Public encounters with law enforcement are governed as much by behavior as by rights. Emotional control, situational awareness, and procedural compliance often determine whether an interaction resolves peacefully or evolves into a criminal case. The justice system records actions, not intentions, and once documented, those actions shape outcomes long after the moment has passed. After the arrest and formal charging phase, the incident entered a quieter but more consequential stage. This phase, often invisible to the public, is where short moments of confrontation produce long-lasting personal, legal, and institutional effects. The aftermath extended far beyond the shopping mall and the patrol vehicles, embedding itself into court records, employment prospects, and future law enforcement encounters. Once charges were filed, the individuals involved became subjects of a formal judicial process. Court appearances, pretrial conditions, and legal representation requirements introduced a new reality: time, cost, and uncertainty. Even before any conviction or dismissal, the existence of charges alone carried measurable consequences. Background checks, housing applications, and job screenings frequently flagged pending cases, creating immediate social and economic strain. From an institutional standpoint, the case also triggered internal review mechanisms. Law enforcement agencies routinely assess incidents involving physical force, resistance, or public controversy. Body-worn camera footage, arrest reports, and supervisor evaluations are examined to ensure actions complied with policy and training standards. These reviews are not optional. They are essential to maintaining procedural legitimacy and public trust. The presence of multiple witnesses and security personnel added another layer of accountability. Civilian observations and private security reports often function as external validation points. When their accounts align with officer documentation, agencies gain confidence that actions were justified within operational guidelines. When discrepancies arise, further scrutiny is applied. The trespass order issued by mall management marked a critical administrative outcome. Such orders are not symbolic. They represent a long-term exclusion from a commercial and social environment that many individuals rely on for work, transportation access, or daily necessities. Violating a trespass order converts future presence into an automatic criminal offense, removing discretion from responding officers and increasing the likelihood of arrest. Psychologically, the incident exemplifies how confrontational worldviews can harden after legal intervention. Individuals who perceive authority as hostile often interpret enforcement as confirmation of persecution rather than consequence. This feedback loop can increase future risk by encouraging avoidance, defiance, or distrust during later encounters with institutions. Conversely, the system's perspective remains behavior-focused. Courts, prosecutors, and police departments rely on documented actions rather than emotional narratives. In this framework, compliance is viewed as a stabilizing factor, while resistance is seen as a multiplier of risk. The legal system does not assess how a person feels about an encounter. It evaluates what actions occurred and whether those actions violated statutes. The case also highlights the modern reality of surveillance and documentation. Shopping malls, parking lots, and public corridors are saturated with cameras. Actions that once depended solely on testimony are now preserved digitally, reducing ambiguity but increasing accountability. For individuals involved in confrontations, this means behavior is rarely confined to memory. It becomes permanent evidence. From a societal perspective, the incident reinforces an uncomfortable truth. Many public conflicts are not driven by criminal intent, but by escalation failure. Moments that could resolve through disengagement or compliance instead spiral due to pride, fear, or misunderstanding. When authority is challenged in a public safety context, systems respond predictably, often with force and legal consequence. The broader implication is not about assigning moral judgment, but about understanding structural inevitability. Once officers perceive a credible risk, whether from alleged threats, aggressive movement, or refusal to comply, the response narrows. Options disappear quickly, replaced by standardized procedures designed to minimize uncertainty rather than maximize dialogue. In reviewing this case as a whole, a clear pattern emerges. The outcome was not the result of a single decision, but of cumulative escalation. Each refusal, each perceived threat, and each act of resistance reduced the space for de-escalation. By the time control was established, the legal path forward had already been set. In the end, this incident stands as a case study in how modern public space enforcement operates. It demonstrates how private property rules, public safety doctrine, emotional behavior, and legal authority intersect. It shows how individuals can move from civilian status to criminal defendant in minutes, and how those minutes can influence years of consequence. The final record does not preserve ardor into the seer, every future encounter shaped by this moment.